Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar from REL Central's Mathematics and Science Research Alliance. I am Arlene Mitchell. John Sutton and I will serve as the facilitator for today's webinar, Sustainable Coaching for Science Teachers, Distance-Based Peer Coaching, with presenters Dr. Gwen Nugent, Dr. Gina Kunz, and Dr. Jim Houston. Today's webinar is designed to increase your knowledge about how coaching can be implemented in rural areas and other school districts with limited resources. It is our goal for you to gain insights into designs, challenges, considerations, and benefits of implementing a peer coaching model in science at the middle school and high school level, and understand the impact of coaching as a job-embedded professional development model on teacher change. The webinar will be led by Dr. Gwen Nugent, who is a research professor at the Nebraska Center for Research on Children, Youth, Family, and Schools in the College of Education at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She is also Director of Rural Education Leadership at the National Center for Research on Rural Education. With a background in cognitive psychology and K-12 instruction, Dr. Nugent has over 30 years of experience coordinating implementation and research projects for the development and delivery of mediated instruction to improve student learning and teacher competencies. Many of her projects are distributed nationally and internationally and have won awards for their educational impact and effectiveness. Dr. Gina Kunz is a research associate professor and an assistant director of the National Center for Research on Children, Youth, Family, and Schools, housed at the College of Education and Human Sciences at the University of Nebraska. Gina is also co-director of the National Center for Research on Rural Education, where she is Director for Rural Outreach and Coordination. Currently, Gina is co-principal investigator for the study CSI, Coaching Science Inquiry in Rural Schools, a professional development program including distance-delivered coaching for middle and high school science teachers in rural schools throughout Nebraska and Iowa. Gina has taken the lead in professional development for teachers and instructional coaches and has been actively involved in project-based instrumentation development. Dr. Jim Houston is a professional educator with specialties in mathematics, science education, and educational administration. As project director for CSI, Coaching Science Inquiry, he manages various research activities and oversees the involvement of personnel that include research assistants and instructional coaches, participant teacher recruitment and retention, and acting as an informational liaison for the participant school administrators and affiliated educational service units. So without further ado, Gina, let me turn this over to you, and you may begin the webinar for Sustainable Coaching for Science Teachers.
Thank you. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Gina Kunz, and I am joined today by my colleagues who have just been introduced, Drs. Gwen Nugent and Jim Houston. Today, we will share information regarding instructional coaching for science teachers in rural schools derived from a current research study that we are conducting. We'll share the design, findings, challenges, considerations, and benefits of implementing this model in STEM for middle and high school. Research supports that professional development for teachers should be accompanied by some type of follow-up support to assist teachers in translating the content and the skills into classroom practice. The use of distance-based technology can help connect teachers in rural schools with instructional coaches. Our research study is titled CSI, Coaching Science Inquiry in Rural Schools. The National Center for Research on Rural Education, housed at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, is funded by the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences. CSI is one of the research studies being conducted as part of the Rural Center. The design is a randomized controlled trial that involves 124 middle and high school rural science teachers. The key professional development element is technology-delivered coaching. This map represents the great reach of our study to participants all across Nebraska, and into Iowa. Our central research question is, what is the impact of professional development on guided scientific inquiry with follow-up coaching, that's our treatment group, compared to no professional development, our control group, on teacher outcomes of inquiry knowledge, skills, self-efficacy, and beliefs, and on student outcomes, inquiry knowledge, skills, engagement, and science attitudes. CSI Inquiry Approach involves teacher-guided inquiry instruction with scaffolding rather than a more traditional instructional approach of confirmatory labs in which students verify the content teachers have presented through demonstration. Our theory of change is that the two components of professional development, those are the Summer Institute and the follow-up instructional coaching, will result in teachers' acquisition of guided inquiry knowledge, skills, self-efficacy, and beliefs, which will then impact their own teaching in the classroom through their teaching practice and ultimately have an impact on student outcomes. Just a little bit about our Summer Institute and what this looked like for our teacher participants. The Summer Institute consisted of an 8-day workshop that was on-site held in Lincoln, Nebraska. It involved modeling guided inquiry instruction, followed by teacher practice with feedback for their own practice of the guided instructional approach. We used video examples of pedagogical strategies, and teachers were given inquiry lessons that could then be used and modified for a 6 to 8 week unit. Their Summer Institute provided a strong foundation for a common language and a shared understanding of what inquiry is and how to implement it. This last point, teachers collectively traveled over 60,000 miles to get to the Summer Institute across the 2 years. And we think this is an aspect that particularly talks to the rural nature of the population. A little bit of information on our instructional coaches. They were seasoned science teachers, collectively representing almost 100 years of classroom experience at the middle and high school level. Training was provided to them consisting of 1 week using video examples and live modeling. These video examples and live modeling serve several purposes. First, it established what an effective teacher-coach relationship looked like and consisted of. They also were able to learn how to co-create behavioral targets for teacher instruction. They gained skills in how to observe teachers when teachers were implementing the lessons in their classroom. They also gained knowledge and skills about how to provide feedback. And a final and very important component was to receive training on the multiple technologies that would be used through this project. In fact, this diagram represents the e-coaching process used in CSI and all of the multiple technologies that were used. Starting on the top left, the teacher would record the classroom lessons so that they could be reviewed by themselves as well as the coaches, and also the data collectors or data coders were able to view the videos of the classroom instruction. The videos were then sent to Dropbox for the coaches and the coders to use, and the coach and the teacher then conducted the coaching session through WebEx, a video conferencing program. The coaching sessions were conducted approximately 1 to 2 times per week for about 45 minutes over a 6 to 8 week period. The video recording of the classroom instruction served as the base for the teacher-coach coaching session, where they engaged in bidirectional reflection and feedback. WebEx was used for the video conferencing, and it was chosen for several reasons. It allowed for two-way video and audio. It also allowed the coaches as well as the teachers to play back video examples of their own classroom instruction. It also allowed for the coaches and the teachers to share documents as well as their desktop. and it provided the recording capability of the coaching sessions themselves.
Gwen, I think you're going to continue here.
Right. Thanks, John. I'm going to talk about the actual study results. We'll start out with the sample, giving you some idea of what did our teachers look like. We had 124 teachers from 109 schools. So if you do the math there, you can see that there was about one teacher per school, and that's very indicative of rural science education. Very often our teachers were the science department, not only for their school, but sometimes for their district. It was about 70% male, 70% female, 30% male. The teachers had, on average, about 13 years of teaching experience, and approximately half of them did have master's degrees. This is an indication of the grades that they taught. We were both middle and high school. You can see the split here. High school was 42%. But what I think, again, is interesting and so indicative of rural is about 30% of our teachers taught both high school and middle school. As far as the students, there were approximately 1,800 students, and as you saw from the map, we were drawing from both Nebraska and Iowa. And we're very happy that they split pretty evenly between high school and middle school. And you can see how we defined high school and middle school in terms of the grades on this slide. The study outcomes, essentially the dependent variables, were really based on the student scientific inquiry abilities and practices that are specified in the standards. And I've listed them there, those constructs of questioning, conducting an investigation, data collection, explaining, and communicating. Those you will see again when I begin to talk about the instruments, because they were embedded into several of our teacher and student instruments. And as far as the teacher outcomes, we really tried to focus on what teacher behaviors are needed to elicit those student skills. All right, we'll start with the teacher results, and you can see, again, a pretty even split between treatment and control teachers. I'm going to present these results in graph form. I think that's visually the easiest way to try to capture what is going on. And I'm also, instead of reporting t-test or f-test or lambdas, I'm going to talk about effect sizes. So we'll start off with teacher inquiry beliefs. And this was a fairly simple data administration because we only had 2 time points. Baseline, you can see on that horizontal axis, that was data collection that was taken before the intervention began, before the teachers had been exposed to any coaching or to the summer professional development. And then this also has a time point at the end of the year, and the end of the year was the end of the academic year in which the teacher participated in the coaching and the teachers delivered their inquiry unit. So you can see the blue line for treatment, the red line for control. The way we analyzed this was looking at the differences between the slopes for the treatment and the control teachers. So this was a between group comparison. We were not looking at some sort of pre-post. It was a difference in slopes between treatment and control. And you can see this was a very large effect size, very significant difference between treatment and control, effect size of 1.03. Moving on to teacher inquiry knowledge. This one had 3 time points, so we see baseline again, and then we took another assessment right after the teachers completed the Summer Institute, and then they filled out another assessment at the end of the time that they delivered their inquiry unit. So that first effect size is essentially from baseline to post-Summer Institute. So that is essentially measuring the effect of the Summer Institute. And you can see an effect size of 0.89. And then we have an effect size baseline to post-unit, which is essentially the entire graph, and that's 1.09. I should tell you a little bit about this particular assessment. This had 3 subscales. It really looked at teacher knowledge of scientific inquiry, or how scientists do inquiry. their knowledge of classroom inquiry, which goes back to those constructs that was on a previous slide that are contained in the standards. And then it had a pedagogical content knowledge section that were teaching scenarios that asked the teacher to select from a list of strategies what would be the most effective inquiry-based scenario for this particular situation. Teacher self-efficacy, and this is how confident teachers were that they could actually perform and the inquiry practice as needed in the classroom. And this is probably our most complicated analysis because we had 4 time points. This has all 4 that I'd previously talked about. So when you look at this kind of piece by piece, that first effect size, baseline to post-summer institute, very large effect size, that's really looking at the effect of the summer institute. And then that second one, the D equal 0.53, that's from the end of the summer institute to the end of the unit. So that's the effect of coaching. And then you looked at the combination of the summer institute and coaching baseline to the end of the year, and you get a 1.29. So those that I just talked about were really self-report from teachers. They were kind of what teachers had in their heads. And the really heart and soul of CSI was how are teachers able to take that knowledge, to take that confidence, to take those beliefs and actually implement it in the classroom. So the way that you really are going to know what's happening in the classroom is to do some observations. And we had 3 observational instruments that are listed here. The first was called the Teacher Inquiry Rubric, and that was developed here. It was project developed. The second one is Equip. That was developed by Jeff Marshall at Clemson University and has been used nationally as an inquiry observation assessment. And the last one is the PICI, and that was also developed here by the CSI staff. So we'll start with the Teacher Inquiry Rubric, and that was based on those 6 constructs that we've already talked about, questioning, investigating, etc. And what we did is we took those constructs and we really tried to break them down and say, okay, what teacher behaviors are needed to actually get the students to be able to perform these inquiry skills. These are the proficiency levels. It was a 4-point rubric, starting out with pre, where there was no evidence of instruction for that particular skill, going on to developing. And how we categorized developing was direct presentation by the teacher using lecture or demonstration. So this was very teacher-centered. Then proficient, which was teacher use of guiding questions, experiences, scaffolding, and/or feedback. This is guided inquiry. So this is really the level that we were trying to get our teachers to reach. There was, however, an exemplary level, and that was using all the scaffolding, feedback, etc., but we were able to actually observe the students performing the skill. So we had moved more to a student-centered paradigm. These are the teacher inquiry results, inquiry rubric results. So you see that first piece, which is really the effect of the Summer Institute, a very large effect size, not very large, but large, 0.73. And then looking at the 2 pieces of the intervention together, the Summer Institute plus coaching, we had an effect size of 1.28. Equip, I should have mentioned the TIR was a very micro instrument. It actually had 31 separate indicators that those observers were looking for. Equip was a more macro instrument. It had 19 indicators. And the overall construct scores are listed there in purple. It dealt with instruction. With discourse, which is very critical with inquiry, that's essentially an assessment of the classroom interaction, what's going on between the teachers and the students, assessment, and then curriculum. And here are the Equip results, and these actually look pretty similar to the TIR. We see the effect of the Summer Institute and then the overall, which looks at the effect of both the Summer Institute and the coaching. And then finally the PICI. And this was not a rubric. This was an interval recording procedure, which meant that our observers were doing observations every 15 seconds. And what they were recording was whether or not the teacher was presenting inquiry instruction. So here's the results for the PICI. Again, very similar graph to the previous two, with medium effect size, the effect of the Summer Institute, and then you can see a large effect size when you look at the two pieces of the intervention together. So this graph is the one that I think is the most telling, because as I was going through, I was saying, you know, these lines all look very similar, but you can really see how similar they look when you have all three of them together. And I think what's very telling about this is this was 3 different inquiry observation instruments, all looking at inquiry through a little different lens, looking at it from a little different perspective, and yet the results across the 3 are very similar. The student results, and very fortunate, split pretty evenly between treatment and control. The first one is middle school inquiry knowledge. This particular assessment was drawn from publicly released items from the NAEP, the SCAS, and the TIMS. And you can see actually that's probably the smallest effect size of all the slides that I'm going to report, but that is a significant difference between treatment and control. And I will say that the high school, the difference between treatment and control was not significant, but we did analyze this particular instrument by scales, and those scales were the questioning, investigating, explaining, communicating back to those inquiry abilities in the standards. And we did have some of the high school scale scores that were significant. And then student self-efficacy, this is probably the strangest looking graph of all the ones that we had, because it was randomly assigned. It was an RCT, and you would expect that treatment and control would start out at baseline at the same, but in this particular case, they did not. The treatment started out a lot lower than the control, but you can look again, what we're looking at is difference in slopes, and you see a difference favoring the treatment, effect size of 0.28, and then if you look at baseline to the end of the year, small effect size of 0.19. And then just as with the teachers, we were very interested with the students, not just what did they have in their heads, but could they actually perform these inquiry skills in the classroom. And so what we used was a student inquiry rubric, and this was kind of the counterpart to the teacher inquiry rubric, the TIR, and it was a 4-level rubric, and we're back to those student inquiry practices. This was adapted from an instrument developed by one of our ESUs here in Nebraska, and it was completed by each teacher for each of their students that were in the study. Ideally, this coding would have been done by our observers, but there was no way from just looking at the video that we really could get a good handle on how well each of those students was performing inquiry. So we asked that the teachers, who are obviously very familiar and more familiar with the students, to complete this for each of the students in the study. Here are the results, and this was post only. That's why you don't see lines from, from baseline to post unit to end of year. It was essentially post only. And it's divided middle school and high school. And I think if you look at these bar graphs, you think, well, gosh, the high school and the middle school, these are very similar results. What actually happened is the high school results were significant, difference between treatment and control. The middle school were not. But the effect sizes, very similar. I think actually the probability level for the middle school was something like 0.056. It just didn't quite make significance. But you can see significant difference favoring the treatment group here in these bar graphs. And finally, the NISA. The NISA is the Nebraska State Science Assessment, and we felt that it was very important that we include this high stakes test as one of our student outcomes that we were looking at. And at least in Nebraska, there's a practice test that the kids often complete. because that gives them some experience in going online and completing the instrument online. So we use the practice test, and we use that specifically because we could dissect the practice test and look specifically at inquiry, as well as scores in earth science and physical science and life science. And for the practice test, we had a middle school inquiry knowledge scale of a not significant, but trending towards significance at 0.10. The overall score, which took into account all of those content areas that I reeled out, however, was not significant, and we did not get any significant difference for the high school, either on the inquiry split out or the overall score. For the actual NISA, there was no significant difference between treatment and control. And unfortunately, for the actual state assessment, we could not get the inquiry scale scores. We couldn't split it out. That would have been better aligned with our intervention. And finally, the PICI-Student, and this is that 15-second interval recording procedure. This is a counterpart to the PICI-T. And what we were recording or observing for the students was on task, off task, or inquiry engaged. And how this worked is the observers would observe a student for 1 minute, and then they'd switch to another student, and they'd continue this cycle until all students were included, and then they would start over. And what we ended up here was a class measure based on individual student responses. We did not have a score per student. It was essentially a score per class. And here are the bar graphs for the PKS. Very definite difference between the treatment and control with an effect size of 1 point.
Well, it'd probably be appropriate at this point to talk a little bit about the coaching evaluation. So did our teachers actually like coaching? Overall, you can take a look at these charts and see that teachers rated the coaching experience very high. They really believed that it promoted self-reflection while involving teaching and learning. The one item that appears to be scored particularly low is with the CSI required too much time for the benefit I gained. I realized that would be reverse coded. So on the 1 to 5 scale or 0 to 5 scale, this one would obviously be the teachers did not believe that it took too much time. Out of this process, we really developed what we consider to be the active ingredients of coaching model. The active ingredients are those those unique components of coaching that are responsible for promoting targeted teacher and student outcomes. Our model addresses the prerequisite characteristics, the relational context, and the coaching processes necessary for positive coaching outcomes. To start this off, we really need to talk about what does the coach have to have, so what are the requisite coach characteristics? When we looked at the requisite coach characteristics, it was clear that the coach needed to have a command of the content area. It was an expectation that teachers would want their coaches to know the specific content and be able to really help the teachers go through the more nuanced levels of the content of, say, for example, physics, that wouldn't necessarily happen in a person that does not have that background. The classroom experience was key. We really needed to have the shared classroom experiences, and it provided credibility for our coaches working with the teachers in the classroom. So it wasn't a matter of it was coming from the university as this is the best way to do it, but rather someone who had been there in their shoes in the classroom doing what had worked. In our study, coaching was provided via distance technology, so that really made the technology and the proficiency with technology a key issue here. They were really on the front line of providing support for technological issues. Could it be the camera or a connection issue, a microphone, whatever it would happen to be. So that was something that was very important to us there. The flexible schedule, this was a piece I don't think can be overstated. Our coaches really had to be flexible. Most of us are very aware of how busy teachers are and how limited their time is during the day. And so coaching schedules would sometimes happen very early in the morning, very late in the evening, and if lucky, we would be able to get it in during the actual planning period for the teacher. So those coaches were almost on call 24/7, 365, although the teachers did let them sleep occasionally. The coaching role was very important, that the coaches had to see their role in this process as a partnership. It really couldn't be, again, handed down as this is how you should do it, but rather the coaches and teachers were going to work together to do what was best. And certainly the strong interpersonal skills, being able to work with people that maybe were a little bit apprehensive to move into a different process, and to help them along and sometimes push them along into making some changes and seeing what kind of positive results they could get. Going back to our model then, we're looking at what the teacher had to bring to the table. It turns out that the teacher had very little to have to bring to the table as requisite skills. What they really needed was a basic content knowledge, nothing that was super high level, but certainly a basic understanding of their content. And probably more importantly was this willingness to engage in the process, or what we've termed the buy-in process. If they were willing to try new ideas and to actually take the suggestions that the coach would provide, it seemed to be what was necessary to get our gains. Going back to the model, coaching was provided with the emphasis of being placed on positive feedback. It was not a corrective type process. The positive tone set the stage for the two-way collaboration and reflection where the teachers and coaches respected one another and they could develop reciprocal trust. The trust allowed for the teachers to be willing to really expose their weaknesses in their instructional practices. The teachers really felt that the non-evaluative nature of coaching provided in the study was critical. The coach was truly present to help the teacher and not to provide an assessment for employment purposes. None of this information was ever shared directly with the administration, but rather it was all a confidential interaction between the teacher and the coach. Collectively, this rapport developed allowed the teachers and coaches to know one another on a more personal level. Teachers often indicated that this coaching partnership and the relationship with their coach prompted them to be prepared for their coaching sessions by citing that my coach was expecting me to be ready for the coaching session, so that's why I had to do it. So that was a plus in there, so that was one of our key pieces. Moving into the coaching process, as you can see, there are several pieces within the process, and I'll go through those a little bit. The joint planning. When we set up the process of planning, the teacher and the coach would meet to discuss what they were going to look for, what types of changes or what type of target goals they were going to have. The process was definitely cooperatively done, where the teacher and coach developed the plan and what was going to be the evaluation of that plan. So we knew what we were looking for as coaches and what we were looking for as teachers. Teachers would then record their classrooms when they practiced their new skills. We already heard Gina talk how the videos were shared with the coaches via Dropbox, and this was serving as the basis for purposeful reflection on what was really happening. The teachers were not just strongly encouraged, but actually asked to watch the video in preparation for their next coaching session, as this really served as an opportunity for the teacher to take an opportunity to stand back and watch themselves teach and see what happened when they did something new or did something different, particularly in what was happening with the students, the way they responded. The feedback that was provided by our coaches was very specific if possible and usually data-driven. So for example, one of the target items for many of our teachers was that area of questioning. When we worked on questioning, say for example, a coach might say in a period of 2 minutes you asked 15 questions, but your total wait time was only approximately 7.3 seconds for all questions combined. This would just give them a very specific idea of what we were looking at. And this usually prompted a reflective discussion where we could talk about, oh gosh, usually the teacher would jump in and say, I really need to slow down, or I need to ask fewer questions, or give the teacher or the students an opportunity to actually respond. So this process went through several iterations over and over again, and it continued through until the joint planning came to the determination that the teacher and the coach believed that the coaching process could be terminated at this point. So the teacher really felt comfortable in continuing on this process without the ongoing coaching support. And ultimately that led to our teacher outcomes that we've talked about, our student outcomes, and ideally it's going to lead to our sustainability piece. One of the things that we looked at with e-coaching was the advantages to e-coaching, and certainly this is a piece that we're all looking at is with the numbers. By doing an electronic coaching version of this, we eliminated the need for the coaches to have to travel between school sites. And you looked at the number that Gina mentioned earlier, almost 60,000 miles to come to Lincoln. This would have been a cost prohibitive piece for actually working with rural teachers. The anywhere, anytime advantage for both our coaches and teachers was huge. We had several situations where we had a coach-teacher combination that was very common in the rural schools, where the teachers would have a secondary role or sometimes a third or fourth or fifth role within the school system. And so finding time to meet, again, it shows on here during weekends or early in the mornings or late in the evenings. I believe one of our teachers had a new baby at home, and so it was sometimes scheduled around when the baby would go to sleep. We could actually have the coaching session. The physical separation between the coaches was something that our teachers felt was very important, as it really allowed for the separation for our coaches from the school administration. It made the coaching process less evaluative, and they didn't feel like the teachers didn't feel that they couldn't share their weaknesses. It did really allow the teachers the opportunity to review their lessons. As a former teacher myself, I know we don't always take the time to sit down and watch the videos or watch our own classrooms. We just don't have that opportunity very often. So being able to actually sit down and watch your classroom and see how students respond and see what type of reactions you get at certain times and certain places of your lesson was very pivotal for some students or for some of our teachers. And certainly the videos provided part of the teaching portfolio for our teachers, part of their staff development processes, and some of the professional development pieces. Challenges. Teachers were not always overly familiar with web-based video conferencing, so a little bit of time and a learning curve for that process. We also learned in a hurry that while the GoPro cameras were relatively easy to use, it really wasn't sufficient to teach them how to use the camera by showing, but rather we needed to actually put the tools into the hands of the teachers. They needed an opportunity to practice actually video recording a lesson, to actually start a WebEx session, or to enter into a WebEx session, or to upload a video to Dropbox. While we're talking about the videos, those were very large video files, typically running about 3 to 3.2 gigabytes per hour. That meant we had some very long transfer times. Sometimes it moved very quickly, maybe as short as 10 to 12 minutes for the video to upload to Dropbox. Other times it was in terms of days. The total study, we had 68,000 hours of video. For those of you that are doing the math, that approached 7 terabytes. So certainly the observational instruments going through that quantity of data alone, and it was going to take 2 to 3 hours just to get through the instrumentation for each video, which would be about a 40 to 50 minute class period, along with just backing that up. Sheer volume of data was huge on this end. And certainly we had ongoing project troubleshooting. We utilized a number of resources. When it was available, we used the local level. And certainly if that wasn't available, we tried to use our very gracious hosts at the regional levels of the Ed Service units to help us out. One of the pieces that we looked at was the cost of coaching for the teacher. It's a lot easier to quantify the costs of coaching for the teacher than it is for the coach, and I'll discuss that here in a minute. If you look at the national average for the teacher's salary, and this was in 2013, around $56,400. Our teachers in this particular study averaged about 9 coaching sessions over. We asked them to do the 8 to 12, 8 to 16 sessions. They averaged about 9. And it took approximately 4 hours to prepare for and actually conduct the coaching session. So doing the math on that, I used 185 days as a typical contract in Nebraska. It worked out to be around $152 per session. The entire cost for the 9 sessions was then about $1,370 for the entire cost per teacher. Now, to give a little perspective on that, I think we have to understand what the costs were for the professional development itself. So the teacher cost for professional development for those 8 days that Gina had mentioned was around $2,450. So for the teacher to enter into this cost, if this was done by a school district, it would cost around $3,820 per teacher. The interesting fact here is I think that about 36% of it was actually attributed to coaching, where the 64% was attributed to the traditional professional development. Now, the reason I didn't include the coaching cost in here is largely because we're not entirely sure where the coaches would actually sit for a sustainability piece. So if those coaches were housed within the school systems, we would have to see what structure they would fit in, because they would probably not fall administratively, but they would probably fall somewhere above the typical faculty position. Many of those positions don't exist within Nebraska, and so finding a number amount that would quantify a salary was difficult to tell. What lessons did we learn from this? Well, we certainly learned that the value of technology was there. We talked about that several times already, but just having the ability to access video and look at it over and over again for coding purposes was fantastic. If we had any problems, we could go back and rewatch the video and see it again to make sure our coding was accurate. And certainly the process of going through this for the teachers, they definitely loved being able to see themselves teach after they got over the initial shock of, did I really wear those pants with that shirt? The power of watching those videos for self-reflection, it really did help to change their instruction. Typically in a coaching session, we would hear a teacher say, and this is where I did such and such, and that was usually before the coach even had the opportunity to point it out. So they really saw what was going on in the videos ahead of time and were able to reflect on their own. There really is a power in practice. We do this with our students all the time, but putting our teachers through the same process where they can practice over and over again, we do eventually affect change. And we were really struck that we had some very high quality science teachers in rural contexts. They're doing some amazing things with very, very few resources in rural contexts. And that was definitely a plus out of the study. This coaching relationship that Gina mentioned was established during our summer PD, and that was easily maintained across distance. And I don't think that the non-evaluative role was a small piece to that. Our coaches and our teachers really bonded together, and they probably are still communicating back and forth now, even though the study is complete. And certainly coaching had a powerful impact on our classroom instruction. A secondary study was actually done to look at peer coaching, and this particular study looked at the value-added benefit of a follow-up PD with a distance-based peer coaching, and looking at the teacher's inquiry knowledge and inquiry-based instruction and their student inquiry knowledge and skills over previous professional development. This was a smaller study, so this gets a little bit messier because we actually broke out some teachers from our original CSI study. So as you look at this, we're looking at teacher self-efficacy, and we're looking specifically at confidence for developing an inquiry lesson in the blue. You can see that this was a 5-point Likert scale, and teachers came in pretty high, starting with their confidence to make an inquiry lesson, starting at 4 out of 5. After their PD, they actually went to 4.5 out of 5, and that pretty much flatlined through the rest of the study for that, primarily because we didn't have an opportunity for the teachers to re-engage in that process. Looking at the confidence for peer coaching, and that's the red line, they started around 3.85 before the Summer Institute, and after the Summer Institute, after they'd received some training on actually how to be a coach, and they'd already had the background experience of the year prior of being coached, they actually went to 4.41. And interestingly, it continued up for the peer coaching. They are reaching the 4.69 level at the end of the study. So that was very promising. The peer coaching seems to be working for confidence in our teachers. This graph has a lot of information on it. The left-hand side of the graph that's in the green, that was all CSI information. The right-hand side is actually for the secondary follow-up study on peer coaching. In order to understand where our teachers ultimately ended up, we needed to know where they came from. So looking at the green line there, that was our control group for the first year of CSI. So pre-CSI to the end of the CSI year, there really wasn't much change. That's essentially a horizontal line. The red line and blue line represent the two pieces of our treatment group for the first year. The red line was the set of teachers that were not actually trained again in the peer coaching model. And so they started out lower than the blue line. And ultimately, if you look clear over at the end of the second year, they more or less flatlined at the end of the CSI experience. So they still maintained their confidence level, but it certainly didn't go up, and we're happy that it didn't go down. The blue line, which is the top line of it here, we ended up with it around 94.75 at the end of CSI. You might notice that these teachers were higher than the red line, and that was by choice. We really wanted to choose those teachers that had a good success with the first experience of coaching science inquiry to give them an opportunity to actually be the coach. And when they entered into the coaching process and doing the peer coaching, when they were done with the process, they're clear up around 98, 99% confident. So this is a very positive piece for showing that teachers are able to maintain this peer coaching. Really leads to our sustainability piece, where I think this really supports the fact that if we do our job well in teaching the teachers how to be a coach and how to do peer coaching, it's something that is sustainable. And for contact information, we're going to direct you towards Dr. Nugent because she needs the extra email, I'm sure. So you can reach her. You can see her information there. And some basic references for you.